Fern Lake Hunting and Fishing Club is a tradition that's well known in East Texas and was started in around 1902, and Pat's been probably the biggest connection to the history of it that I know of, and it's a privilege to sit down and listen to him and let him tell some stories and let us get them documented. We appreciate everybody's participation in this, and Pat, thank you.
I am William Fern. I'm 90 years old. Within a week, I'm gonna be 91. I learned to swim, to fish, and run motors. I came to Fern every chance that I got.
So you're like a third generation owner?
Yeah.
Start at the beginning. Whose idea was the first one to come out?
My grandfather, John Brownrigg, he was an avid fisherman, and he had an interest in Caddo Lake. He went down and fished, and he and Vernon Hilliard were related. One thing that led to another, and they said, you know, we ought to build a lake. And Vernon was in the haberdashery business, and he didn't like it. He was an outdoor man, and so he sold his interest, and John Brownrigg and Vernon Hilliard, I think, were the founders of this thing. And they envisioned 25 members, and they had a lot of friends that bought into this. One thing led to another, and they bought the land and built the dam, and that established Fern Lake. I was that in 1902, yeah.
And who built the dam?
Mac George. And one of the guys that worked for him was Dink Sanders. And Dink Sanders rebuilt the dam twice. He was instrumental in raising the dam and rebuilding the spillway, and I attribute to Dink Sanders the existence of the current lake.
And what did they build for the members at first?
They built a road because this was on private property, and it wasn't a county road at any spot. They built all of the roads, and they built one clubhouse. You couldn't cook there, but you could sit and eat food. And so their wives had to bring cooked food, or they barbecued. This was a hunting and fishing club originally. And once they brought their families down, the wives complained about the hunting. And so they stopped hunting, and it was strictly a fishing club and a swimming club. They moved it to the east about 50 yards. The Zacharys bought that house. That got very popular. The members complained that they didn't have access to the house because somebody else was a member. They met and decided that you pick out a lot. You were not allowed to be within 200 feet of another member unless they both agreed to be closer. That's how the club got members' houses.
Well, in the beginning, were most all the houses that were built in the proximity of the original clubhouse, or what's now the Zachary House?
Yeah, I would say the peninsula that jutted out to the west, John Brownrigg had a house, Vernon Hilliard had a house, and my father bought the third house that was on the peninsula. Emery Fry built a house. Dr. Littlejohn built, he filled in the causeway between the island that was crossed from what amounted to, ended up being Camp Fern. And so Dr. Littlejohn was the brother of Maggie. Vernon and Maggie started the Camp Fern.
Well, like that house that you're talking about, are you talking about the house that's now, that was the Sullivans and it's now the Gilstrap house?
Yeah.
So that was Dr. Littlejohn's house?
Yeah.
Which was, back in the beginning, was one of the first houses.
Yeah, that's right.
And they called it Doctor's Island.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so people would pull up and honk, and the caretaker would come down.
Once they established that they could build houses, they needed a keeper, needed him to clean fish and barbecue and take care of the property. They were valued the houses, the furniture, and the boats and the motors. So they had a keeper, and I don't know what the first keeper's name was, but Hervey and Tilly were keepers that succeeded the original. The club built a house for them to live in, and they had two children, and they raised those children as keepers.
The caretaker before J.D. was Norman Duvall.
Yeah.
Which would have been in probably the 60s. They took over after Hervey, is that right?
Yeah. Other than that, their presence was needed to intercept anybody that was not allowed on the property. You honked twice from the car, and that would bring Hervey to your house. You told Hervey that you needed Tilly, and he would tell her.
If you go back into time, how did camp start, and when did they sort of move over across the lake and establish what is now Camp Fern?
My mother and Aunt Mag Hilliard, they had daughters the same age. They had also friends that had daughters. Aunt Mag and my mother devised a scheme where they would get about 10 girls, and they stayed in my father's house, Uncle Vernon's house, and they ate at my grandmother's house, which was in the middle. Some of the mothers taught swimming, and some of the mothers taught nature. They split it up, and they made beds and everything that the girls needed. And Aunt Mag and Mother got together, and they said this was so successful, somebody ought to do it full time. That's when Vernon Hilliard jumped in and he said I would move over and start a camp on the North Shore. Maggie and Uncle Vernon started Camp Fern.
So that was probably what, 1934? I think.
Yeah,
That's kind of what they
yeah.
had to sign.
And it was originally a girls' camp. Uncle Vernon had a nephew, Gene Hilliard, and a nephew, Frank Vernon Hilliard, and they wanted to go to camp. And so they started boys' camp after girls' camp. And the girls' camp was 4 weeks, and the boys' camp was 2 weeks. And I went at the age 6 because I was a good swimmer to begin with. Aunt Mag asked my mother, she said, "Won't he be homesick?" And my mother said, "No, I don't think so." And she cried when I went. And Daddy had to put her in the boat and drive over and see me. And Daddy said, I just waved at him, and I said, "Hey." Mother was crestfallen.
So in those days, you didn't go to camp by car. They just took you over there in a boat.
In a boat.
And let you out.
Yeah,
And then they'd come pick you up.
yeah. Uncle Vernon built a road, and it was a dirt road to begin with. And fortunately, we have clay soil, and so that road held up. They got the county to build the oil road, and it went all the way around behind the dam. It was replaced by a road that is now all-weather road, and I think it's gonna last beyond my lifetime.
Well, if you go back into when the road you're talking about was built by the county, didn't Mr. Burns, didn't he have some connections with the county commissioners?
Yeah.
And so he would allow, so we allowed people to come through our property so they could run the school buses for the school in exchange for them building us a road.
That's right.
And when did they get electricity down here?
REA created the Rural Electric Association, was created in Franklin Roosevelt's term, that got us electricity for every house, early 40s.
What did members do for electricity prior to that, between '02 and the late 40s?
Well, they didn't have it. My grandfather and my father built a Delco that forced us to have electricity for those 2 houses. Uncle Vernon, once REA came, he electrified Camp Fern, and that made it accessible for families.
So did the REA all come in and provide electricity to pretty much everybody in the club and the camp about the same time?
No, they made the lines, and SWEPCO came and put your house in, connected to the main lines.
How many houses were out here at that time, Pat?
25 houses plus a club boathouse plus Camp Fern. And they had their own boathouse and all the cabins. They had 10 or so cabins. We had no water. Each family brought 10-gallon bottles. We bathed in the lake. They took water out of the lake and pumped it. You could wash dishes and things like that.
So we were kind of working our way up. Did anything change down here like during World War II? I mean, was it?
We got bigger motors because war surplus. They had 50 horse motors they sold for peanuts. The government did. Everybody had a big motor. Prior to that, I would say 5 or 10 horse was maximum.
So like in the early 50s, as far as the condition of the water and the lake, it was a lot of moss, a lot of lily pads, except for the deep part. And,
Yeah.
And where would everybody swim and
Well, they had a club pier, swimming pier over near the dam. If you wanted to do that, you could drive your boat, swim there, but everybody didn't have a pier.
Because I remember as a kid, up until about 1958, we would swim at the club pier by the Adney.
Yeah.
So you go on up to in the 50s, and then somewhere along 58, it seemed like we did a rebuild on the dam and we drained the lake.
We rebuilt the dam twice. Each time it was higher and allowed us to get more water in the lake.
And didn't they like re-divert the spillway, because the old spillway was one direction and they went.
Yeah, they
Straight away.
rebuilt it.
After 58, then everybody kind of went to their own piers because the moss and the lily pads sort of went away, and it kind of made a cleaner lake for everybody.
Yep. Yeah, I remember the lily pads in the shallow end of the lake, and they were slimy underneath. I swam through them. The shares changed hands. Some of the people moved away, some of them died, and their kids moved away and sold them. So we had new group of members. The membership changed hands regularly. Water pipe that drew water out of the lake into the club building was resting on 2 concrete blocks in the water on the bottom of the lake. Jack Mann Sr. was the president of the club at that time. I was about 10 years old, and he approached me and he said, "The pipe has fallen off the concrete blocks and it's in the sand." He said, "We can't get water from the lake." And I said, "You want me to go down and lift it up and put it on the blocks?" And he said, "Can you?" And I said, "Piece of cake." And so I went and picked up the pipe and laid it on the concrete blocks, and we had lake water.
And you saved the day.
Pat, what about, tell the story about when we had a club member who had a confrontation with the caretaker.
Yeah.
And he got kicked out of the club. This would be probably in about 1950, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And it was still Herbie.
This club member had a group of men that came down and played poker once a month. And on one occasion, he got drunk. And so the board met and they polled the members, and we decided we had rather have the keeper than the member. And so we told him that he was no longer welcome. And so the keeper stayed.
So basically, instead of selling his membership,
He gave it to his son.
He talked the club into allowing him to move it down to the next generation.
Yeah, but he quit playing poker.
Yeah.
He was not allowed on the club premises.
Yeah. So if you get into the 50s, sort of what I recall is there used to be a lot of floating logs and stumps in the lake and all that, and over time, members would pull those things out to where it was open water all the time. Otherwise, you were dodging stumps all the time when you were out there on the lake.
Yeah, the club didn't cut any timber before they built the lake. And so these logs floated up one end and the other end stayed in the bottom. And so the club members would put a rope around the end that sticks up, and they started their motors and dragged them out of the mud. And so they cleared the lake. Many of them, that's myself.
If you move on up into, say, the 60s, and I mean, camp was still going, and it seemed like it went to like 5 weeks and 5 weeks for girls and boys. It later went to smaller amounts of time. And
Yeah, they had a girls' camp and a boys' camp, but in the middle they put co-ed camp, 2 weeks. And so they had girls' camp for a month and co-ed for 2 weeks and boys' camp for a month. And that was the time I was a counselor, and everything went smoothly.
Remember anything about the old tree house that was around the lake where my house is now?
Yeah, I remember it, and at the end of that arm, up the hill, we built a cabin, and it was totally screened. And so the camp, you took your bedroll and put them in canoes and paddled up to that shore, and then you carried your bedroll and your food, and you would sleep on the sand. You know, we were 10 or 12 years old, and we didn't make big to-do of it, but
probably maybe 20 feet in the air. Back in the 70s, when JD was the caretaker, and then he decided he would host lunch, and he would get the Monroes to bring their barbecue pit from Beaumont, and he even had a pool table he brought from some private club, I think from the Gator Club on Caddo Lake.
JD was something else. Had his family, his wife and daughter with him. He was a good friend of Dick Monroe's. JD came every day.
Did y'all water ski on the lake?
When you were a kid?
No, we didn't have water skis. We had aquaplane, predated water skis. And you had to be careful of falling off, because that aquaplane would go down and it was come up and it hit you in the head, you may drown.
Did y'all wear life jackets while doing this?
No.
No, I didn't figure, yeah. I didn't figure.
We were all 10-foot tall and bulletproof.
Do you recall, I would say in around 1958, when probably, your dad and A.C. Johnson bought 2 big ski boats, or big at the time, and they bought them from Logan Whaley, and they had Lone Star boats with the 45 Mercuries on them.
Yeah.
And that's when the skiing really started, I think, on the lake.
Peninsula over here, Dad, there was a road that came out on it to these few houses, the
Yeah,
Cowans
yeah.
and the Manns.
And there was a lady, she was an old maid, and she lived with 2 other old maids. And
The Williams sisters.
yeah, and she built that rock house.
Okay.
They came down seldom.
As far as the houses that are now the Whaleys and the D'Estes and the MacPhails, those were all probably built in the 50s.
Yeah.
Because they didn't really have a good road going around that side of the lake.
Did you have a lot of parties out here
Yeah.
when you were growing up?
When you were like out of high school,
Yeah.
is it?
Yeah, we had a
Can you talk
gradu-
about that?
we had a graduation party at my father's house, and I had a niece that married Trini Lopez. Yeah.
He was a party in himself.
Yeah, we had a group on my graduating class, and some stayed all night. My father never complained.
And your mother fed them. I mean, whoever came down, she just always had a meal.
Yeah.
Did she have a rule that if you're gonna come down and swim, bring a casserole?
Yeah. She never enforced that rule.
Back in the 60s and 70s, I recall they had about as good a time down here at Fern Lake as anybody.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, like Chub Merritt, what do you sort of remember about him?
Well,
I know he fished a lot.
Ike Cowan was a friend of my father's, and my father told him to buy a share. So he did. And Kay Cowan was my age, and she married Dick Chub Merritt. And Chub was a handful himself. And they had 3 boys, and they raised them on this lake. One of the youngest boy, Mike Merritt, has the current share.
What about the Monroes? Do you remember anything about the Brown Rig Monroes that would be?
Well, my uncle Tam Brownrigg designed and built a 2-story boathouse, and he got a call. He was a doctor. One of his patients needed his presence, and he lived in Beaumont, so he left, and my father had to finish the 2-story boathouse.
So we all used to share that boathouse. The furs and the...
My mother got tired of the crowded 2-story boathouse, and so she built current boathouse.
It was in 1969, and I remember that. The boathouse that was for 2 families, the families got too big,
Yeah.
and so we had to spread out. And do you recall those years when we would, on 4th of July, when Albert McPhail would get his boat going and put a ski rope out, and everybody would tie on with an inner tube, and we'd have the parades around the lake that lasted for 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Those were good times back in the 70s, I remember.
You moved down here in the 80s?
84. We moved here. Alice and I loved to gaze at the lake. we see the seasons go by and we didn't take advantage of it because she's gone. And I miss her. I have great memories of it. Sorry I'm so old that I can't get out anymore.
You want to bust out the hydro ski and go out there and try?